The morning rained with cold determination, washing the polished marble sidewalks and impeccable windows of the Alvarada Clinic. Inside, the lobby was a sanctuary of artificial silence, a microcosm where the heavy air of luxury mingled with the aseptic smell of disinfectant. Clara, in her nurse's uniform, felt each drop of rain on the window like a drumbeat in her own soul, a somber melody that echoed the fatigue accumulated in her shoulders. She was finishing her shift, but the weight of that routine wouldn't lift. She watched the cleaning staff, invisible beings who passed by with squeegees and mops, polishing the floors that high society walked on with shoes worth a year's wages. Their invisibility was a mirror of her own. She felt the indifference of the patients, with their designer handbags and gazes that seemed to see right through people, as if the working class were just part of the furniture, a functional detail, not a human being. The contrast was stark. The grey outside, the coldness inside, and in the middle, she, a point of empathy in an ocean of disinterest. That place was a machine, and Clara was a cog in it. She wondered if others felt the same way, this feeling of being a cog in the wheel of indifference. It was as if the clinic were a bubble, a world apart, where suffering was just a statistic and healing a product. Her touch, always careful and gentle when taking blood pressure, when changing a needle, was an act of silent rebellion, a defiance of the coldness that emanated from every corner of that place. She saw the fear in the patient's eyes, the anxiety of those awaiting a diagnosis, but also the arrogance of those who paid for the right not to wait. It was a sickening duality, a dance of privilege and submission, and she in the middle merely existed, a ghost of dignity in a place where dignity was measured in numbers. The rain continued, relentless, and Clara's soul, tired and aching, absorbed all the melancholy of the atmosphere, preparing for a clash she couldn't even imagine. The calm before the storm, the coldness was epidemic in that lobby. A man in an expensive suit walked by with a cell phone to his ear, his voice loud and impatient, as if his life were more important than the others there. The woman, with her skin taut and a bored expression, leafed through a fashion magazine without looking up, oblivious to the murmur of low voices and hurried footsteps. They didn't see Clara, nor the young cleaner bent over, mopping the floor, nor the doorman opening the door for yet another luxury car. They didn't see real life. It was as if they had been raised in a greenhouse, far from the earth, the dirt, the sweat. Clara felt a pang of sadness, not for herself, but for them, for this lack of humanity that made them so small despite all their money. It was a void nothing could fill. That place was a tomb where wealth buried compassion. The lobby lights, however bright, couldn't illuminate the darkness forming. In the hearts of those who circulated there, the facade was impeccable, but beneath the veneer a deep crack lay, a moral flaw that dehumanized everyone, both those who considered themselves superior and those who submitted. Clara sighed, a barely audible sound, the sound of her own resignation. She thought of her son, the rent bill, the urgency of keeping that job, even if it suffocated her insides. Every day was a battle between her essence and the coldness of the place. And, more often than not, the coldness won, forcing her to silence her inner voice, to hide the kindness that lived within her. It was a daily battle, and she was tired. The rain outside intensified, beating harder against the glass. The sound was now an echo of the chaos Clara felt in her soul, a premonition of what was to come. She tried to focus on the simple task of organizing the medical records, but her eyes, with a vivacity that seemed out of place, swept the lobby, searching for something, anything, to break. The monotony of the scene. She knew something was wrong, that this apparent peace was merely the calm before a moral storm. And she, with her heightened sensitivity, noticed the signs, the muffled murmurs, the fleeting glances, the invisible tremor in the air. It was an omen, a silent warning that the universe was about to test her greatest virtue, her dignity, and confront her with the abyss of injustice. She had no idea that her life was about to change, and that fate would present her with an impossible choice that would redefine everything she believed in. Clara, the nurse with eyes as tired as they were kind, was a painting of paradoxes. Her immaculate white uniform hid a daily struggle against the stain of inequality. Her skirt, impeccably hemmed, covered her rubber slippers, worn by the miles of silent dedication. Her eyes, which seemed to have absorbed the pain of every patient who crossed her path, were windows to a soul that refused to harden. At 30, she was a keen observer, able to read the micro-expressions on faces, the tremors in hands, the fear disguised as arrogance. She was not just a task performer, but an interpreter of souls, a beacon of sensitivity in an icy harbor. The dilemma that gnawed at her was the constant clash between her instinct to care and the cold reality of a system that priced life, transforming aid into a luxury service, inaccessible to those who needed it most. While Clara represented empathy and struggle, Dr. Alencar was the embodiment of the opposite. A man in his 50s, he moved through the lobby with the gravity of a monarch. His suit, a tailored cut that seemed sculpted to his figure, was a second skin. The watch, a gleaming steel disc on his wrist, marked time in dollar signs, not in seconds of life. His eyes, behind thin-framed glasses, saw not people, only numbers on medical charts. His cruelty was manifested not in shouting or explicit violence, but in an icy indifference, a condescension that made the interlocutor feel suddenly smaller, more insignificant. He was the system itself, profit over compassion, efficiency over humanity. In his mind, life was a product, and health, a high-value commodity, exclusive to those who could afford the price. He was power, authority, arrogance, made flesh. The relationship between Clara and Dr. Alencar was one of silent and profound tension. To him, she was just another cog, a disposable element in the machine he ruled with an iron fist. He saw her as an employee, a tool, and not as a human being with dreams, fears, and a family to support. She, on the other hand, saw him as the epitome of all that was wrong, the symbol of oppression, greed, and dehumanization. It was a clash of worlds, of values. Every morning, she felt the weight of his presence, the icy air he brought with him. His gaze was an annihilation, a denial of her existence. She strove to be invisible, to go unnoticed, so that her dignity wouldn't be crushed by expensive heels and arrogance disguised as formality. But in her silence, she harbored an unshakable defiance, a moral strength that he, with his limited vision, would never be able to perceive. The clinic, the setting for this dance of opposites, was a character in itself. Its corridors, labyrinths of whiteness and coldness, seemed endless. The echo of footsteps and low voices was lost in a heavy silence, as if the air itself were filtered and sterilized. The reception area was a powerhouse, where forced smiles disguised hierarchy. There, health was negotiated, and the value of life was discussed in monetary terms. Wealthy patients walked as if they owned the space, with an intimacy only money could buy. Clara, passing by them, felt the contrast. The cool marble skin beneath her hands as she prepared a tray, the soft breathing of a critically ill patient who lacked health insurance to be there, the silent urgency of someone who needed help but couldn't afford it. Clara's life unfolded between the coldness of the clinic and the warmth of her humble home, where sunlight streamed through the window with the same intensity as the love she felt for her family. It was a duality, the outside, where her dignity was put to the test, and the inside, where that same dignity was her greatest asset. And Dr. Alencar was the portal between these two worlds, the oppressor who kept her trapped in a job that paid the bills but stole her soul. He didn't know the meaning of her struggle, every penny that entered her account, every sacrifice she made. He didn't see her, and this invisibility was both a curse and a protection. For in the silence of her existence, Clara guarded the most dangerous weapon of all, moral truth. He was the king of his castle, and she, the servant. But he didn't know that in a struggle for power, the greatest victories aren't always won with swords. They can be achieved with silence, resilience, and the courage of a heart that refuses to be bought. Dr. Alencar, in his arrogance, never imagined that the person he despised most would be the only one capable of exposing his moral failings, his greed, his lack of humanity, and that the stage of his greatest glory, his luxury clinic, would become the stage of his greatest humiliation. The irony of fate was weaving its thread, preparing the moment when the two worlds would collide, and the dignity of an invisible woman would shine brighter than all the gold in the castle. With each passing day, Clara became more aware of the gulf that separated her from Dr. Alencar. She saw the contrast in the way he addressed the other doctors, with formal respect and superficial interest, and the way he walked past her and the cleaning staff as if they were mere shadows. It was a wall of arrogance, built with the bricks of money and status. He represented the system, the institution that valued profit over well-being, bureaucracy over empathy. And Clara was the silent opposition, the small point of light that refused to be swallowed by the darkness. The tension between them was like a taut rope, one thread away from snapping, and both, unknowingly, were on the edge of a precipice. The clinic, with its cold, modern architecture, was a reflection of its owner's soul, glass and steel, without warmth, without life, a monument to medicine as a business. And Clara, in her simple uniform, was a living reminder that medicine is, above all, a vocation, a call to care and compassion. She walked through the corridors, and her presence, though discreet, was felt by the most attentive patients. The touch of her hands, her low, calm voice, the way she leaned in to hear what the elderly man was trying to say, all of it was a silent cry against indifference. And this opposition, this resistance, was growing within her, fueled by the injustice she saw every day. What she didn't know was that, soon, her inner rebellion would be put to the test in a real battle. The silence in the lobby was actually a background noise, the sound of coins falling into a giant safe. And Clara, with her heightened sensitivity, heard this sound, this silent clamor. She felt the pressure of her own conscience, the weight of being an accomplice to a system she detested. But at the same time, the need to survive was an even greater burden. With each day, she felt the dilemma tighten, her throat dry, her heart shrink. And life seemed to be a series of difficult choices, of small sacrifices that took her further and further away from who she was. Dr. Alencar, in his blindness, failed to notice the storm brewing in Clara's eyes, the fire that her repressed kindness ignited within his chest. He was the predator, and she was the prey. But in that power play, the predator underestimated the prey. He didn't see her strength, the dignity that sustained her, the intelligence hidden beneath the veneer of humility. Dr. Alencar saw only a maid, a ghost that roamed his corridors. And this blindness would be his undoing. Fate was already set. The conflict was inevitable, and the stage, the lobby of the Alvarado Clinic, was ready to witness the fall of the king and the rise of the heroine. The story of Clara and Dr. Alencar wasn't just about two people, but about the universal battle between greed and compassion, injustice and dignity. And the script, written by fate itself, was about to take its most dramatic turn. The clinic's air was a haze of expensive perfume and arrogance, and Clara, with her heightened sense of smell, could smell the inequality, the privilege, and it suffocated her. With every step, every forced smile, every "yes, sir," she felt she was losing a piece of herself, and her soul, tired of being invisible, cried out for an act of rebellion, for a gesture that would reconnect her with her essence. She just didn't know that the universe was about to give her this opportunity, brutally and unexpectedly. The rainy morning, the impeccable lobby, the watch on Dr. Alencar's wrist. Everything was in its rightful place, ready for the fight. And in the midst of it all, Clara, with her big heart and weary soul, was about to face her greatest challenge. The silence of the lobby, previously heavy and artificial, was shattered. The glass door opened with a dull thud, and like a hurricane of desperation, a thin young man with soaked clothes and a look of terror in his eyes burst into the clinic. He looked about the age of a boy, but the urgency in his gaze was that of a man. He carried with him the smell of rain mixed with the cold sweat of panic, a mixture that clashed with the expensive perfume and the clean air of the place. He ran, tripping over his own feet, and leaned against the marble counter, his hands trembling. The air in the clinic, previously still, became electric, a tension that caused the previously scattered gazes of doctors and patients to turn to him, not with curiosity, but with a mixture of strangeness and contempt. The young man seemed unconcerned. His sole focus was his father. He was sweating coldly, panting, and the words came out with difficulty, choked with fear. "Please, a doctor. My father. He's in the car. He can't breathe. Please." His voice, a cry for help, was a strange, discordant noise in that silent room. Dr. Alencar, at his reception desk, looked up from his clipboard with subtle irritation, a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth. He took him in from head to toe, his sweat-stained shirt, his ripped jeans at the knee, his old wet shoes. It was a sight that disturbed him, that took him out of his comfort zone. That urgency, that desperation, clashed with the air of sophistication he worked so hard to maintain. The young man repeated his plea, his voice now more desperate. "He's in terrible pain. Please, it's an emergency. His face is blue. I don't know what to do." His plea was a silent cry for compassion in a place where compassion was a worthless currency. The looks around were judgmental, uncomfortable. A woman adjusted her bag and stepped away. A man cleared his throat, as if the sound of the other's pain were a personal nuisance. But Clara, who was on the other side of the counter, felt the young man's panic in her own skin. Their eyes met, and in a second, a current of empathy took hold. She saw the pain, the love, the fear, and she knew in her heart that something had to be done. Dr. Alencar, with a calculated slowness that bordered on humiliation, picked up a gold pen and tapped gently on the clipboard. That small metallic sound was a wall between him and the young man. He wasn't looking at the boy, but rather at the space beside him, as if he weren't there. "Sir," he said, his voice cold and polite, "this is a private clinic. We don't treat homeless people. You should go to a public hospital." His words were like blades, each syllable cutting through the little hope left in the young man's heart. It was a refusal masked by formality, a cruel and inhuman rejection, and Dr. Alencar delivered it with the same indifference with which he would have refused a glass of water to a stranger. Those words pierced Clara like a needle. She felt the injustice in her body, indignation rising like a fever. The young man paled, his face falling into a nameless despair. He tried to argue, his voice breaking, "But he doesn't have time. It's an emergency, please." Dr. Alencar didn't even hear him. He had already returned his attention to the clipboard, as if the matter were closed. It was public humiliation, the denial of help to a human being at their most vulnerable, and the audience, the wealthy patients, seemed to approve, as if social order had been restored, the poor in their place, the rich in their castle. It was at that moment that Clara's dignity collided head-on with Dr. Alencar's cynicism. She, who had always remained invisible, could no longer remain silent. Instinct, the call of her vocation, pushed her forward. Her body, previously paralyzed by the inertia of routine, moved on its own. Her heart pounded in her chest. She looked at the glass door, imagining the man dying outside in an old, forgotten car. And she looked at Dr. Alencar, the personification of greed. It was a moral crossroads, a point of no return. The fear of losing her job was real, but the fear of being complicit in negligence was far greater. Clara's mind raced, a whirlwind of thoughts. What could she do? Leave? Walk away? Pretend she hadn't seen? Or act? Break protocol? Risk everything? The image of the terrified young man fixed itself in her mind, the urgency in his gaze. She could hear Dr. Alencar speaking to one of the directors, his voice polite and superficial, ignoring the tragedy unfolding just a few feet away. The indifference was a silent violence, and Clara could not be complicit. She took one step, then another, toward the emergency equipment closet. That gesture, however small, was an act of rebellion, a declaration of war. Her hand trembled as she reached for the cabinet, but she opened it firmly. Dr. Alencar's eyes, which had been ignoring her until then, fixed on her. There was no longer indifference, but a growing fury. He watched her grab an emergency bag, a portable defibrillator, tubes and needles. It was open insubordination, a direct challenge to his authority. Silence returned to the lobby, but it was a heavy, tense silence, like the air before a lightning strike. All eyes were on Clara. She knew every second was precious, that every step toward the door was a step toward the precipice. The emergency bag in his hands seemed to carry a symbolic weight, the weight of life and death, of dignity and humiliation. Dr. Alencar stood, his expression hardened, a deep furrow between his eyebrows. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He couldn't believe this woman, whom he barely considered a person, was publicly defying him. The young man, still panicked, looked at Clara, her eyes shining with new hope, a light he thought had been extinguished. He didn't know her, but suddenly she was his only salvation. Clara looked at the young man, and the decision was made. Her head told her to back off, to return to her seat, to keep her job. But her heart screamed. A man's life was at stake, and she couldn't bow down. She couldn't be complicit in negligence, no matter the consequences. She knew that at that moment her dignity was worth more than her salary. She moved with determination, her step firm, her breathing calm. The lobby was her stage, and life her audience, and injustice her enemy. Dr. Alencar, in his silent fury, watched her with the intensity of a predator. He couldn't allow this, not in his clinic, not on his territory. He stepped forward, his face pale, his voice low and dangerous. But Clara had already crossed the line. She ignored his presence and, emergency bag in hand, walked toward the door. She was on her mission, and no threat, no fear, no obstacle would make her turn back. It was her turn to fight, and she was willing to fight to the end. Dr. Alencar, his face contorted with rage, ordered the security guards to approach. His footsteps were heavy on the marble, each one a hammer striking Clara's dignity. "Stop her!" he growled, his voice low but filled with restrained fury. The humiliation he felt was immense, a personal affront to his authority. What would become of his luxury clinic if a nurse's insubordination were allowed? Chaos, a loss of control. And he could not allow chaos to enter his fortress of order and wealth. The security guards moved toward him, their large, imposing bodies, a human obstacle preventing Clara from reaching the door. The young man, paralyzed with fear, watched the scene, his face contorted in silent supplication. He felt guilty, the trigger for all this confusion. The first security guard to reach her grabbed her arm, a sudden gesture that caused her to drop some equipment from her bag. The sound of the fall, the rattling of needles and tubes on the floor, echoed in the silence of the lobby. It was the sound of desperation, of injustice. Clara felt the man's strength, but her eyes never left the door. She looked at Dr. Alencar, who stared at her with a mixture of triumph and contempt, as if she were a child needing to be punished for a mischief. "You're fired, Clara," he hissed, a sick satisfaction in his voice. "And insubordination like this here will not be tolerated. You will never work in a serious clinic again." His words were like punches, a verbal violence that left her breathless. But she didn't react, just remained silent, her eyes fixed on the door, on the life of the man dying outside. The young man, visibly paler, took a step forward, begging, "Please, sir, don't punish her. It's my fault. Please, my father. He's going to die." The boy's plea was genuine, a cry that should have softened any heart. But Dr. Alencar only stared at him with more contempt. He didn't see a desperate son, but an intruder, a problem that needed solving. That boy was the symbol of his disturbed peace, and he hated him for it. The audience, the other patients and doctors, watched with judgmental looks. The murmur of voices previously muffled became louder, gossip and speculation. What was she thinking? Complete insubordination. Serves her right. She should have been fired a long time ago. Clara felt the disapproval, the weight of everyone's gaze on her as if she were a criminal. Those faces, once indifferent, were now judges, their verdicts cruel and swift. She was alone, completely alone, and the loneliness weighed more heavily than the security guard's hand on her arm. She thought of her son, of the humiliation he would feel if he knew his mother had been fired like that. The injustice was a poison that filled her insides. Clara was escorted to Dr. Alencar's office. The path, which had previously been routine, became a walk of shame. The clinic directors, gathered for a morning meeting, were seated at the table, and Dr. Alencar, in his triumphant fury, fired her in front of everyone, his voice loud and clear, echoing throughout the room. "I do not tolerate unprofessionalism, and above all, I do not tolerate rebellion. You have no right to question my authority. And here, I am the only authority." He smiled, a cruel, satisfied smile. He wanted to set an example. He wanted everyone to know that compassion had no place in his empire of wealth. The air in the room was thick, heavy with Dr. Alencar's arrogance. He sat in his leather chair, arms crossed, the expression of a king who had just crushed a rebellion. "Now please leave. Security will escort you to the door." He waved his hand dismissively. Clara, her head held high but her heart aching, felt humiliation in its purest form. The lack of respect was more painful than losing her job, and she, her dignity wounded but not broken, prepared to leave. Defeat was evident. Injustice had won, or so it seemed. She walked to the door, each step a struggle, feeling the weight of her backpack of belongings on her back. She looked at Dr. Alencar, who had already turned his attention to his directors, as if she had never existed. Her invisibility had been reaffirmed, but in a much crueler way. She was a ghost, no longer allowed to haunt this place. The security guard gave her a gentle push, and the door closed behind her with a soft click, the sound of closure. She was outside, in the street, in the rain, without a job, without money, without anything. And the pain was overwhelming. The young man was still there in the lobby, his eyes brimming with tears. He'd seen her fired, he'd seen her humiliated, and he felt a different kind of pain in his chest, the pain of gratitude mixed with guilt. He felt terrified and helpless. He wanted to do something, anything, to help her. But he was just a boy, and she was a woman. The injustice seemed colossal. Dr. Alencar in his office had already forgotten the incident. He was back to his numbers, his profits. He didn't know their story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The tension grew with each passing second. The young man felt like a ticking time bomb, the anguish in his chest turning into silent determination. He had to do something. He couldn't allow the woman who had risked everything for his father to lose everything. But what? He was poor, had no connections, no influence. The only power he had was the truth, and the truth he knew was a powerful weapon. He looked at Dr. Alencar, who stared back impatiently, waiting for him to leave. He wanted to rid himself of this nuisance once and for all. But the boy suddenly felt a strength he hadn't known he possessed. He moved toward the table. Clara's humiliation, her public dismissal, had been the climax of injustice. But as in every good story, darkness precedes light, and Dr. Alencar, in his blindness, didn't see the light that was about to explode in his face. He sat on his throne, certain of his victory, but the throne he would discover was made of ice, and the fall inevitable. And Clara, her soul in pieces, didn't know that her defeat was merely the prelude to a much greater victory. A victory that would be won by an unlikely savior, a poor, invisible young man. The stage was set, the audience attentive, and the protagonist of the turnaround, a boy with a secret. The tension was palpable. The silence that followed Clara's dismissal was more deafening than any scream. It was the sound of shock, of disbelief. The directors in Dr. Alencar's office, though they didn't know her, felt the weight of injustice. But they said nothing. Fear was a wall as high as arrogance, and Dr. Alencar reigned over a kingdom of silence and submission. He was at the height of his power, of his control, and he had no idea that, in those very seconds, power was slipping through his fingers. Fate, with a macabre sense of humor, was preparing its revenge, and it would be as grand as Clara's. Humiliation. The young man, his body trembling but his eyes fixed on Dr. Alencar, seemed to have found new courage. He approached the table, ignoring the security guard, who eyed him suspiciously. It was the height of contempt. The boy, the intruder, the problem was back. Dr. Alencar glared at him, his patience quickly running out. "I already told you to leave. There's nothing here for you." His voice was a whisper of threat. The young man, however, didn't back down. His eyes, once filled with panic, now shone with cold determination. He knew his every word would be a blow, and he was ready to fight for the woman who risked everything for him. He stood before Dr. Alencar, his small frame a stark contrast to the mahogany desk's imposing appearance. "I'm not asking for a favor. I'm telling you that the man you refuse to see is my father." His voice, previously fragile, came out with surprising firmness. Dr. Alencar laughed, a dry, mocking sound. "And what does that mean to me? That your father is yet another one who can't afford the consultation?" He leaned back in his chair, sarcasm dripping from his voice. It was the moment of final humiliation, the final dose of contempt he would bestow upon the boy, and, by extension, upon the nurse who had defied him. The young man, with the calm of someone holding a bomb about to explode, raised his voice. "You refuse to see Dr. Felipe Marquez." The name, spoken in a grave tone, echoed through the lobby, sending a chill down the spines of those present. Dr. Alencar, who was about to dismiss him again, stopped in mid-motion. His expression, previously arrogant, transformed into a mask of confusion. He frowned. The name was familiar, but from where? And suddenly, recognition. Dr. Felipe Marquez, the country's greatest philanthropist, the founder of the largest network of free hospitals, the charity that rivaled his clinic in prestige but not in profit. Dr. Alencar's face paled, the blood draining from his cheeks. He stared at the young man, his brain working at top speed to process the information. It couldn't be. That boy, in dirty clothes, that man in a rusty old car, was that Dr. Felipe Marquez, that man he had just condemned to death. Fear, cold and visceral, began to seep through his veins. He looked at the directors in the room, who were also pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. It was the sound of shock, of realization. The king had mocked the emperor. The young man, seeing the impact of his words, continued, his voice growing stronger. "That man is the reason thousands of people who can't afford services like yours have access to healthcare. His life, his career, his profits, Everything is an insult to the memory of my mother, whom he dedicated his life to honoring, caring for those most in need. And you, in your greed and arrogance, have just neglected the person who could have been his salvation. You threw his life away because it had no price, because it had no price tag. The boy's words were like fiery arrows, burning through Dr. Alenkar's skin, piercing his armor of arrogance. He staggered to his feet, his face contorted in a mixture of panic and despair. He looked at the door, at the old, forgotten car on the street. The life he had scorned was that of a billionaire who could have secured the financial future of his clinic. He was losing not only a patient, but the benefactor, the patron he needed to expand his business. He had spit in the hand that could have given him everything. The irony was brutal and his downfall imminent. Dr. Alencar felt like a man who had just discovered he had sold his soul for a handful of sand. He looked at the directors, who now regarded him with a mixture of horror and disappointment. They no longer saw their all-powerful boss, but a fool, a man blinded by his own arrogance. The silence in the lobby was a testament to this. The news, he knew, would spread like wildfire. The Alvarado clinic, his empire, was at risk, and all because of an act of indifference, a moment of blindness. The humiliation he had inflicted on Clara was now being returned to him tenfold. He had dug his own grave. The young man, his chest puffed out with dignity, continued speaking. "I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness. I'm here to show you that you were wrong, that the value of a life isn't in a check, but in a heart, that my mother didn't die in vain, and that kindness, compassion, and humility, which you so despise, are the things that truly matter. My mother was the greatest nurse who ever lived. That's why my father created hospitals, and she, the nurse who just left here, was the only one who dared to help me, the only one who truly cared. You may have fired her, but you will never have her dignity." The young man's words were a cold shower on Dr. Alencar's face. He felt small, insignificant, before this boy who was teaching him a life lesson. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out, stuck in his throat. He remembered the nurse, her determined expression, her kind eyes, and he remembered his own arrogance, his contempt. The contrast was overwhelming. He had mocked dignity, and now his own dignity was being torn to shreds in front of everyone. The fall was brutal, and fate relentless. The young man turned toward the door, his mission accomplished. He had avenged Clara's dignity, his father's honor. His voice, once trembling, was now firm and confident. He was no longer the frightened boy who had entered the clinic. He was the heir to an empire of kindness, the son of a man who transformed pain into compassion. And Dr. Alencar, on his throne, was the dethroned king, his crown, made of money and arrogance, crumbling to dust. Poetic justice had found its way, and it had a name, the name of that boy's father. Dr. Alencar had cared nothing for life, and now life was taking its toll on him. Dr. Alencar, in a mixture of despair and humiliation, felt the air grow thin. The scene, once his glory, was becoming the stage for his downfall. He looked at the directors who rose and, with the silence of those retreating from an impending catastrophe, left the room. The machine he had built with so much effort was crumbling before his eyes. He hadn't just lost a patient, he had lost everything: his trust, his respect, his reputation. And the irony was that his downfall came not from a powerful rival, but from an 18-year-old boy he had despised. Fate, with a sadistic sense of humor, was teaching him his most painful lesson. Still in shock, Dr. Alencar tried to compose himself. He stood, his hand trembling as he tried to straighten his tie. But it was useless. His facade, his armor of power had been shattered. He stared at the glass door, watching the young man walk away into the rain. That boy was the messenger of his downfall. He felt like a king deposed by a peasant, and the pain of humiliation was sharper than any other pain he had ever felt. He who had built his career on the pain of others was now feeling his own, and it was unbearable. Life, in its relentless irony, was exacting a heavy price for his lack of compassion, and the price was his own kingdom. From that moment on, Dr. Alencar would no longer be the king of the clinic, but the man who lost everything to his arrogance. His story, told in whispers and gossip, would be that of a man who chose profit over life and who was punished for it. And the story of Clara, the nurse he fired, would be that of a silent heroine, the woman who, with an act of kindness, turned the tables. Her downfall was the price, and the price was fair. In his pursuit of wealth, he had forgotten that the greatest wealth, compassion, cannot be bought. And now he would have to live with the consequences of his blindness, and his blindness, ironically, cost him his sight. The revelation was like a punch to the gut for Dr. Alencar. Dr. Felipe Marquez's name echoed in his mind, a sound of doom. He tried desperately to reconstruct the facts, but the image of the man in the car, the young man in simple clothes, was so overwhelming that he couldn't believe he had made such a brutal mistake. He, the man who prided himself on his wit and his flair for power, had scorned the person who could have changed the fate of his clinic. The irony was cruel, the punishment immediate. The ground seemed to have opened up beneath his feet. His arrogance, once a fortress, was now a leaden armor that sank him into the abyss of shame. The young man, with a newfound calm, looked at Dr. Alencar. He no longer saw the man who had humiliated him, but the man who was about to fall. Revenge, he knew, was a dish best served cold, and the temperature there in that lobby had dropped to 0. He had no need for shouting, for threats. The truth was his only weapon, and the truth was more powerful than money, stronger than arrogance. His voice, once choked with panic, was now the sound of justice, the echo of dignity. His presence, once insignificant, was now monumental, imposing. He was the unlikely savior, the hero of a story not even Clara knew she was living. Dr. Alencar, in his fury and despair, tried in vain to find a way out. He considered running to his car, trying to reverse the situation. But it was too late. Time, which he had despised, was now his most ruthless judge. He felt trapped, suffocated. The mask of power and arrogance had fallen, revealing a small, insignificant man who had lost everything through his own blindness. Life, which he had transformed into a commodity, was now exacting a heavy price for his lack of compassion. And the price was his ruin. The previously silent directors whispered among themselves, their eyes disapproving. They no longer saw their leader, but the man who had just jeopardized the clinic's reputation. That act of negligence, the refusal to provide care, would be headline news the next day. They backed away, as if the stain of Dr. Alencar's shame were contagious. He was alone, abandoned in his own icy kingdom. The stage of his glory had become the stage of his downfall. Poetic justice was relentless, and it took the form of an 18-year-old boy he had treated with contempt. The revelation, like a bomb, exploded in silence. The sound of the fall was internal, a sound only Dr. Alencar could hear. He stared at the glass door, seeing his own reflection. It wasn't the man he knew. It was a stranger, a loser, a fool. His life, which he had built on the foundations of money and power, was crumbling before his eyes. He felt dizzy. His life, which he had so masterfully controlled, was now out of his control. And the cause of it all was a boy he had once considered a nobody. The young man, with a subtle smile of victory on his lips, watched the scene, the giant's fall. He felt no hatred, no resentment, only the satisfaction of justice. He had done the right thing, the thing his mother had taught him to do. He turned and walked toward the door. His mission had been accomplished. He had avenged his family's dignity, his mother's honor, and Dr. Alencar, the king of his ice castle, was now in his own hell. The revelation had been the catalyst. The rest was just the fall. And the fall, he knew, would be long and painful. Life, in its irony, was exacting the price for his own arrogance. The power shift was total, brutal, and silent. The young man didn't need an army, threats, or violence. His weapon was dignity, his ammunition, the truth. Dr. Alencar, the king of his castle, was deposed with a single sentence. His power, built on oppression and greed, crumbled in seconds. His symbolic fall was more painful than the real one. His crown, made of money and arrogance, crumbled to dust. He felt naked, exposed, before everyone. The world he had built with so much effort was crumbling before his eyes. He was no longer the leader, but the fool. His empire of ice had melted. The audience, the wealthy patients, and the directors witnessed the scene, their shock turning into a mixture of horror and disapproval. They no longer saw the leader, but the man who had neglected the life of a philanthropist, a billionaire. The news would spread like wildfire, the clinic's reputation forever tarnished. Dr. Alencar's name, once synonymous with excellence and power, would now be synonymous with arrogance and negligence. His victory, Clara's dismissal, had become his greatest defeat. Poetic justice had found its way, and it was relentless. The young man, with the dignity of a king, turned and walked toward the door. He needed nothing more. His mission was accomplished. The humiliation he had suffered, the pain his family had felt, had been avenged. And he knew that his victory was not just his, but that of all the invisible, of all the oppressed. He was the unlikely savior, the hero of a story no one imagined existed. He walked away, leaving behind the chaos, the ruin, the hell he had created for Dr. Alencar. Dr. Alencar, in his fury and despair, tried in vain to find a way out. He considered running to his car, trying to reverse the situation, but it was too late. His blindness, his arrogance, had condemned him. Life, which he had transformed into a commodity, was now exacting a heavy price for his lack of compassion. And the price was his ruin. He felt trapped, suffocated. The mask of power and arrogance had fallen, revealing a small, insignificant man who had lost everything through his own blindness. He stared at the glass door, seeing his own reflection. It wasn't the man he knew. He was a stranger, a loser, a fool. His life, which he had built on the foundations of money and power, was crumbling before his eyes. He felt dizzy, lightheaded. His life, which he had so masterfully controlled, was now out of his control. And the cause of it all was a boy he had considered nothing. Poetic justice was relentless, and it took the form of an 18-year-old boy he had treated with contempt. The power shift was so complete that Dr. Alencar himself, in his despair, felt like a man who had just discovered he had sold his soul for a handful of sand. He looked at the directors, who now stared at him with a mixture of horror and disappointment. They no longer saw their all-powerful boss, but a fool, a man blinded by his own arrogance. The silence in the lobby was a testament to this. The news, he knew, would spread like wildfire. The Alvarado Clinic, his empire, was at risk, and all because of an act of indifference, a moment of blindness. He felt small, insignificant before this boy who was teaching him a life lesson. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come, stuck in his throat. He remembered the nurse, her determined expression, her kind eyes, and he remembered his own arrogance, his contempt. The contrast was overwhelming. He had mocked dignity, and now his own dignity was being torn to shreds in front of everyone. The fall was brutal, and fate relentless. Life, in its irony, exacted a heavy price from him for his lack of compassion, and the price was his own kingdom. From that moment on, Dr. Alencar would no longer be the king of the clinic, but the man who lost everything to his arrogance. His story, told in whispers and gossip, would be that of a man who chose profit over life and who was punished for it. And the story of Clara, the nurse he fired, would be that of a silent heroine. The woman who, with an act of kindness, turned the tables. Her downfall was the price, and the price was fair. In his pursuit of wealth, he had forgotten that the greatest wealth, compassion, cannot be bought. And now he would have to live with the consequences of his blindness. The young man, with a subtle smile of victory on his lips, watched the scene, the fall of the giant. He felt no hatred, no resentment, only the satisfaction of justice. He had done the right thing, the thing his mother had taught him to do. He turned and walked toward the door. His mission had been accomplished. He had avenged his family's dignity, his mother's honor, and Dr. Alencar, on his throne, was the dethroned king, his crown, made of money and arrogance, crumbling to dust. Dr. Alencar, in a mixture of despair and humiliation, felt the air grow thin. The scene, once his glory, was becoming the stage for his downfall. He looked at the directors who rose and, with the silence of those retreating from an impending catastrophe, left the room. The machine he had built with so much effort was crumbling before his eyes. He hadn't just lost a patient, he had lost everything: his trust, his respect, his reputation. And the irony was that his downfall came not from a powerful rival, but from an 18-year-old boy he had despised. Still in shock, Dr. Alencar tried to compose himself. He stood, his hand trembling as he tried to straighten his tie. But it was useless. His facade, his armor of power, had been shattered. He stared at the glass door, watching the young man walk away into the rain. That boy was the messenger of his downfall. He felt like a king deposed by a peasant, and the pain of humiliation was sharper than any other pain he had ever felt. He, who had built his career on the pain of others, was now feeling his own, and it was unbearable. Life, in its relentless irony, was exacting a heavy price for his lack of compassion, and the price was his own kingdom. Dr. Alencar's reaction was that of a man drowning on dry land. The pallor of his face was a reflection of shock, a mirror of the ruin he saw in his mind. He shook his head, a gesture of denial, as if he could erase what had just happened. The young man's words, Dr. Felipe Marquez, rang in his head like an ominous echo, a death sentence for his career. The expensive suit, once a suit of power armor, seemed to have shrunk, suffocating him. He felt cold sweat run down his back, and a dizziness hit him, the world spinning in a whirlwind of despair. He, the man who had always controlled everything, was now completely out of control. The directors, who had previously regarded him with submission, now viewed him with a mixture of revulsion and disappointment. They walked away, one by one, as if he were a leper. They knew word would spread, that the clinic's reputation would be forever tarnished. Dr. Alencar's lack of compassion, his arrogance, had become a liability, a stain they didn't want on their own resumes. Submission turned to abandonment, respect to contempt. Dr. Alencar's throne of power, built on the sands of greed, was crumbling, and the audience, previously silenced by fear, watched the fall with a sense of justice. In the lobby, the patients and staff, who had previously judged Clara, now regarded Dr. Alencar with a heavy silence. The murmur of gossip had ceased, replaced by an atmosphere of shock and disbelief. They had seen the all-powerful man, the king of that empire, humiliated by a young man for an act of kindness. This was the turning point, the scene where the villain finally receives his comeuppance. The sneer on Dr. Alencar's face had disappeared, replaced by a mask of terror. He was the moral lesson, the example of what greed and arrogance can do to a man. The security guard, who had just escorted Clara out, watched with wide eyes. He didn't know the boy's name, but he knew something momentous had happened. Dr. Alencar's look of despair, the officer's attitude, everything told him the tide had turned. He felt relieved, as if a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The injustice had been reversed, not by a revolution, but by an act of dignity. The moral of the story was clear, and he was witnessing it in real time. That moment he knew would be told for years: the fall of the king, the rise of the peasant. The silence was deafening, the sound of defeat. Dr. Alencar looked at the door, at the continuing rain, at the old, forgotten car. The life he had scorned was that of a man who built an empire of compassion. The irony was cruel, the punishment immediate. He felt like a man who had just sold his soul for a handful of sand, and now he would have to live with the consequences of his blindness. His arrogance, his greed had condemned him, and life, in its irony, exacted the price for his own lack of compassion. The scene was surreal. The audience, the directors, the staff, everyone watched the giant fall. Dr. Alencar was a broken man, his facade of power and arrogance shattered. He stared into space, his eyes glazed, his mind desperately trying to process what had happened. The world he had built with so much effort was crumbling before his eyes. He was no longer the boss, but the fool, and he didn't know what to do. His life, which he had so masterfully controlled, was now completely out of his control. And the cause of it all was a boy he had once considered nothing. Clara, outside the clinic, watched the scene. Through the rain-fogged glass, she couldn't hear what was happening inside, but the desperation on Dr. Alencar's face was a silent scream she understood perfectly. The mask of power and arrogance had fallen, revealing a small, terrified man. The young man, now visibly calmer and with his head held high, turned and walked toward the door. The scene was a painting of justice, a silent and dignified revenge. The victory wasn't hers, but it was hers, because the victory was one of compassion over greed, of humility over arrogance, and she, with her purse in her hands, was the living symbol of restored dignity. She felt the rain on her face, mingling with the tears that were silently streaming down her face. They weren't tears of sadness, but of relief. The layoff, which had hurt her, now seemed like a gift. That job, which had suffocated her, was now a distant memory. She had lost a job, but she had regained her soul. That moment, she knew, would be a turning point in her life. Fate had placed her at a crossroads, and she had chosen the more difficult path, the path of dignity. And now life was rewarding her, not with money, but with something far more valuable: peace of mind. She looked at Dr. Alencar, who stood in the middle of the lobby, his shoulders hunched, his face pale. He looked like a ghost, a shadow of his former self. He had built an empire of wealth, but he had lost his humanity, and now he was paying the price. Clara felt a pang of pity for him, but it was quickly replaced by a calm satisfaction. He had deserved it. He had been cruel, and life, in its irony, was punishing him just as cruelly. Poetic justice had found its way, and it took the form of a dismissed nurse and a young man with the dignity of a king. Clara's future, once uncertain, now seemed to have a new direction. She didn't know what would happen, but she felt the universe was guiding her towards something better. She had lost her job, but she had found her courage. She had lost her security, but she had found her freedom. She had lost everything, but she had regained her dignity. Life, she knew, would not be easy, but she was ready for the fight, and the fight, she knew, would be worth it. Because her fight was for her soul, for her dignity, for her essence, and her essence, she knew, was her greatest wealth. She turned and began walking, the rain washing away the asphalt, and her soul, the weight of that place. Her step was light, her heart at peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that from that moment on, her life would be different. The victory wasn't material, but moral. And the moral was clear. Kindness always triumphs over greed. Compassion always triumphs over arrogance. And dignity, even if invisible, is stronger than any empire. Their story, the story of Clara and Dr. Alencar, was the story of humanity. And humanity, she knew, was in good hands. The final scene was one of quiet dignity. The rain continued to fall, washing the polished marble sidewalks and impeccable windows of the Alvarado Clinic. Inside, Dr. Alencar, the dethroned king, stood alone, his armor of power and arrogance shattered. Outside, Clara, the dismissed nurse, walked, her step light, her heart at peace. Her defeat was her victory, her humiliation was her redemption, and her story, the story of an invisible woman who became a heroine, would be told for years to come as a lesson that compassion, kindness, and humility are what truly matter. The moral of the story was as clear as rainwater. The value of a life lies not in a check, but in a heart. And life, in its relentless irony, exacts the price of our lack of compassion. The story of Clara, the nurse, and Dr. Alencar, the arrogant boss, was a universal lesson in human dignity, class injustice, and the invisible power of kindness. And this lesson, she knew, was her greatest reward. Her victory was not material, but moral, and her morality, she knew, was her greatest wealth. Her life, from that moment on, would never be the same. And she, from that moment on, would never be the same. She was living proof that dignity is stronger than any empire. The final scene, with the rain washing the asphalt and Clara walking into the unknown, was an image of hope. The hope that kindness always triumphs over evil. The hope that compassion always triumphs over greed. The hope that dignity, even if invisible, is stronger than any power. The story of Clara, the nurse, and Dr. Alencar, the arrogant boss, was a universal lesson about human dignity, class injustice, and the invisible power of kindness. And this lesson, she knew, was her greatest reward. Her victory was not material, but moral, and her morality, she knew, was her greatest wealth. Her life, from that moment on, would never be the same, and she, from that moment on, would never be the same. She was living proof that dignity is stronger than any empire. The rain continued to fall, washing away the pain, the humiliation, the injustice, and the world, which had seemed so unfair, now seemed to have new meaning. Life, she knew, was a series of choices, and her choice, to be true to herself, to be true to her dignity, had led her to her greatest victory. Her victory was not material, but moral, and her morality, she knew, was her greatest wealth. Her life, from that moment on, would never be the same, and she, from that moment on, would never be the same. She was living proof that dignity is stronger than any empire. The final scene, with the rain washing the asphalt and Clara walking into the unknown, was an image of hope. The hope that kindness always triumphs over evil, the hope that compassion always triumphs over greed, the hope that dignity, even if invisible, is stronger than any power. The story of Clara, the nurse, and Dr. Alencar, the arrogant boss, was a universal lesson about human dignity, class injustice, and the invisible power of kindness. And this lesson, she knew, was her greatest reward. Her victory was not material, but moral, and her morality, she knew, was her greatest wealth. Her life, from that moment on, would never be the same, and she, from that moment on, would never be the same. She was living proof that dignity is stronger than any empire. The rain continued to fall, washing away the pain, the humiliation, the injustice, and the world, which had seemed so unfair, now seemed to have new meaning. Life, she knew, was a series of choices, and her choice, to be true to herself, to be true to her dignity, had led her to her greatest victory. Her victory was not material but moral, and her morality, she knew, was her greatest wealth. Her life, from that moment on, would never be the same, and she, from that moment on, would never be the same. She was living proof that dignity is stronger than any empire. The last image is of Clara walking in the rain, her body wrapped in a thin coat that didn't protect her from the cold, but seemed to be the only thing keeping her warm. Her step, once heavy and tired, was now light and determined. The sound of the rain was a gentle melody that blended with the sound of her own breathing. She looked up at the grey sky, feeling the water on her face, and a serene smile formed on her lips. The dismissal, which had hurt her, was now a liberation. The job, which had imprisoned her, was now a distant memory. She had lost everything, but she had regained her dignity. Her victory was not material, but moral, and her morals, she knew, were her greatest wealth. Clara turned one last time, looking at the clinic. Its glass and steel facade, once a symbol of power and success, now seemed fragile, vulnerable. She saw Dr. Alankar in the lobby, his body shrunken, his mask of power and arrogance shattered. He seemed like a ghost, a shadow of himself. He had built an empire of wealth, but he had lost his humanity, and now he was paying the price. Clara felt a pang of pity for him, but the pity was quickly replaced by calm. Satisfaction. He had deserved it. He had been cruel, and life in its irony was punishing him just as cruelly. Poetic justice had found its way, and it took the form of a dismissed nurse and a young man with the dignity of a king. Clara's life, once uncertain, now seemed to have a new direction. She didn't know what would happen, but she felt the universe was guiding her towards something better. She had lost her job, but she had found her courage. She had lost her security, but she had found her freedom. She had lost everything, but she had regained her dignity. Life, she knew, would not be easy, but she was ready for the fight. And the fight, she knew, would be worth it, because her fight was for her soul, for her dignity, for her essence. And her essence, she knew, was her greatest wealth. Clara's future would never be the same, but neither, she knew, would Dr. Alankar's future. His reputation was tarnished, his career at risk. He had built his empire on the foundations of greed and arrogance, and now it was crumbling before his eyes. He, the king, had been deposed by a peasant, and the lesson was clear. Compassion, kindness, and humility, which he so despised, were what truly mattered. And he, in his blindness, had only discovered this when it was too late. Fate, with a sadistic sense of humor, had prepared its revenge, and it was as grand as Clara's humiliation. Life, in its relentless irony, exacted a heavy price from him for his lack of compassion, and the price was his own kingdom. Dr. Alankar was a broken man, his facade of power and arrogance shattered. He stared into space, his eyes glazed, his mind desperately trying to process what had happened. His life, which he had so masterfully controlled, was now completely out of his control, and the cause of it all was a boy he had once considered nothing. The rain continued to fall, washing away the pain, the humiliation, the injustice, and the world, which had seemed so unfair, now seemed to have new meaning. Life, she knew, was a series of choices, and her choice, to be true to herself, to be true to her dignity, had led her to her greatest victory. Her victory was not material, but moral, and her morality, she knew, was her greatest wealth. Her life, from that moment on, would never be the same, and she, from that moment on, would never be the same. She was living proof that dignity is stronger than any empire.